The air above the Italian countryside was heavy with mist, as if the mountains themselves were holding their breath. A lone Roman scout, Gaius Varro, gripped the reins of his horse tighter. The Alps loomed like jagged teeth ahead, capped with snow that gleamed under the pale dawn light. He had heard whispers, rumors carried by terrified merchants, that Hannibal Barca, the Carthaginian general, was crossing the impossible. But this sight stole the breath from his chest. Through the swirling fog came the faint, rhythmic crunch of feet on ice. Then a low, guttural trumpet. Not Roman, not anything Gaius had ever heard. He urged his horse forward a few steps and froze. Emerging from the whiteness was a massive gray shape, its outline barely visible. Another followed, and then another. He squinted. Were those elephants? Elephants. Here, on the snowbound Alps. The sight was so unreal that for a heartbeat, Gaius thought he was dreaming. The Carthaginians weren't supposed to be here. The Alps were supposed to be their grave. But Hannibal Barca had done what every Roman general had said was impossible. He had brought an army and wore elephants over the roof of the world. The largest elephant bellowed, the sound rolling down the icy slopes like thunder. Behind them, soldiers wrapped in furs trudged through the snow, their breath steaming in the freezing air. Their eyes were sunken from frostbite and hunger, but a strange fire burned in them. They were alive, and they were coming for Rome. Far to the south, the Roman Senate would soon receive reports of this nightmare. But by then it would be too late. Hannibal wasn't just crossing mountains. He was crossing the line between fear and legend. But this moment was only the beginning, and the world had no idea what Hannibal had planned next. 2 weeks earlier, on the other side of the Alps, Hannibal had stood before his men on a narrow mountain ledge. The wind howled like a living thing, clawing at their cloaks. Below them, the land of Gaul stretched out in shades of gray and green. Hannibal's dark eyes scanned the horizon, a fierce determination etched into every line of his face. "We are the blade that will pierce Rome's heart," he told them, his voice carrying even over the storm. "They think these mountains will stop us, but Rome has grown soft, arrogant, and when we descend upon their land, they will tremble." His officers exchanged nervous glances. The crossing had already cost them hundreds of men. Avalanches had swallowed whole units. Frostbite had claimed toes, fingers, and lives. But Hannibal's presence was magnetic, like fire in a blizzard. Even the elephants, their great ears flapping miserably in the cold, seemed to draw strength from his unshakable will. That night, Hannibal walked alone among the sleeping forms of his soldiers. He could hear the creak of ice beneath their makeshift shelters, the occasional groan of an elephant shifting its weight. He thought of his father, Hannibal Barca, who had fought Rome before him. As a boy, Hannibal had sworn before the gods never to be a friend of Rome. That oath burned in his heart now, a fire that no mountain storm could quench. At dawn, they began their descent. The path was a nightmare, sheer cliffs, icy slopes, and rock slides that sent men screaming into the abyss. But Hannibal was always at the front, urging them onward. "One more step," he called. "One more step, and Italy is ours." When they finally reached the foothills, their numbers were reduced, their bodies battered. But when the surviving soldiers looked up and saw the fertile valleys of Italy stretching before them, their exhaustion turned to awe. They had done the impossible, and Rome had no idea what was coming. But Hannibal's journey had not gone unnoticed. In Rome, senators gathered in the Curia Hostilia, their voices rising in panic. "Elephants?" one cried. "Over the Alps? It's impossible." Another slammed his fist on the marble table. "If this is true, then we are facing not just an invasion, but a genius who thinks like no Roman ever has." And while Rome debated, Hannibal marched. He didn't come to raid or retreat. He came to destroy. But even he could not predict the blood-soaked fields and shattered legions that awaited. And as the first Carthaginian war horns echoed across northern Italy, one thing was certain. Rome's greatest threat was no longer across the sea. It was already at their door. The valley floor shimmered under a pale autumn sun, a cruel contrast to the bitter cold the Carthaginians had just endured. The surviving soldiers stumbled onto Italian soil, boots sinking into mud softened by early rains. Some dropped to their knees, kissing the ground. Others stared at the horizon, silent and hollow-eyed. They had crossed death itself, but the real war was just beginning. Hannibal stood at the front of his battered column, a crimson cloak draped across his shoulders. He inhaled deeply, letting the warmer air fill his lungs. His lips curled into a grim smile. Italy, Rome's heartland. He had marched an army across the Alps, a feat so insane that even his enemies would have to respect it. But he knew this was only the opening act. Rome was strong, proud, and unbroken. To strike fear into such a beast, he would need more than audacity. Nearby, Mago, his younger brother, adjusted the leather straps on his armor and approached. "We've lost nearly half our force," he said quietly. "Frostbite, avalanches, Gauls turning on us. The men are exhausted." Hannibal's dark eyes never left the horizon. "And yet, Mago, the men who remain are the ones Rome should truly fear. They have seen the gods test them in the mountains, and they survived. Rome's legions have faced battles, but not despair." He turned, his voice rising so the nearest soldiers could hear. "We are not weak. We are forged in ice and blood. And we march not for plunder, but for vengeance." The soldiers, despite their wounds and hunger, pounded their shields in approval. The sound rolled across the valley like distant thunder. Even the elephants seemed to sense the moment, lifting their trunks and trumpeting. A chilling, alien sound that would soon echo across Italy. As they moved south, Hannibal used cunning instead of brute force. He forged alliances with local tribes who resented Rome's heavy taxes and harsh rule. Around campfires, chieftains leaned close to Hannibal's maps, their faces flickering in the firelight. "Rome thinks itself invincible," Hannibal told them. "But the wolf can be hunted if you know its habits." His charisma was magnetic. He didn't just command soldiers. He convinced entire peoples that Rome could bleed. One night, under a canopy of stars, Hannibal sat apart from his men, sharpening his sword. He traced the blade with a cloth, but his mind was far away, back to his childhood. He saw himself as a boy, small and eager, standing beside his father, Hannibal Barca. The memory was sharp. Hannibal kneeling, making him place a tiny hand on the altar. "Never be a friend of Rome," his father had said. That promise had become the drumbeat of his life. But even as Hannibal's army gathered strength, Rome was stirring. News of the invasion spread like wildfire. Farmers abandoned their fields. Merchants whispered in fear. And in the Curia, senators' faces were pale under torchlight. Quintus Fabius Maximus, an experienced statesman, slammed his hand on the marble table. "Do not underestimate him. This is not a raider or a bandit. Hannibal is a wolf at our throat." Others scoffed, insisting Rome's legions would crush him swiftly. Pride clouded their judgment, and pride was exactly what Hannibal was counting on. As the Carthaginians advanced, a Roman force finally moved to confront them near the Trebia River. It was winter now, and a cruel wind swept across the plains. Hannibal stood on a ridge overlooking the frozen landscape, his cloak snapping in the wind. He watched the Roman campfires flicker in the distance. His lips curled. They were overconfident, marching without caution, their soldiers eager for glory. That night, Hannibal called his officers close. Around a low-burning fire, he spoke in a calm, measured tone. "Tomorrow we teach them what fear tastes like. They believe winter protects them, but winter is my ally." He gestured toward a shallow, icy stream. "At dawn, They will cross the river half-frozen. And when their blood slows in their veins, we strike. His men exchanged glances, some skeptical, some exhilarated. But none dared doubt him. Hannibal's audacity had carried them this far. If he said the gods themselves would intervene, they might have believed him. Before dawn, the Carthaginians positioned hidden troops in the riverbed's reeds, their breath misting in the dark. The elephants stood silent and restless. Hannibal looked over the battlefield, his heartbeat steady. "Today," he whispered to himself, "Rome learns my name." At first light, Roman horns blared. Their legions splashed into the Trebia's freezing waters, shields high, their sandals slipping on ice. On the far bank, Hannibal's soldiers appeared like phantoms through the mist, their war cries piercing the morning. Then, out of nowhere, the hidden Carthaginian cavalry charged, spears leveled, smashing into the Roman flank. The river ran red as chaos erupted. The elephants barreled forward, their massive forms unstoppable. Roman soldiers screamed as tusks gored men and shields splintered. The sound of cracking bone mixed with the roar of war horns. Hannibal's strategy had worked perfectly. The Romans, numb from the freezing water, broke formation. Panic spread like wildfire. From his vantage point, Hannibal watched the Roman lines crumble. He felt no joy, only grim satisfaction. "This is only the beginning," he muttered. But even as victory swept the field, Hannibal knew Rome was not defeated. The Trebia was a warning, not a final blow. And Rome, proud, vengeful Rome, would not take humiliation lightly. Even now, as the Carthaginian soldiers cheered among the fallen, messengers were already racing toward the heart of the Republic. What Hannibal didn't yet know was that his boldest gambles were still ahead, and the bloodiest fields were yet to come. Snow still clung to the mountain peaks in the distance, but the Italian plains were waking into spring. Wildflowers swayed in the breeze, their colors almost mocking the carnage that had painted the Trebia red just weeks before. The Roman Republic, humiliated and enraged, summoned fresh legions. They would avenge their fallen comrades or die trying. But Hannibal was already on the move. His scouts darted across the countryside, reading the land like a book, while his cavalry, the feared Numidian horsemen, harassed Roman supply lines. Villages that had once sent grain to Rome now whispered Hannibal's name with awe. In the evenings, by firelight, Italian farmers told their children, "The man who crossed the mountains walks among us." Still, not all were convinced. Many cities remained loyal to Rome, their gates bolted shut at the sight of Carthaginian banners. Hannibal knew he couldn't count on Italy rising against the Republic. Not yet. To break Rome's spine, he needed a victory so terrifying it would echo for generations. The opportunity came at Lake Trasimene. The narrow road hugged the water's edge, hemmed in by steep hills thick with fog. Hannibal's army waited silently in the pre-dawn darkness, hidden among the trees. The lake was perfectly still, a sheet of glass under a pale sky. Somewhere out on the water, a heron cried, a lonely sound, swallowed by mist. Hannibal crouched beside Mago, his breath a faint cloud. "They'll see the bait force on the road and rush in," he whispered. "When they do, the hills will come alive." Down on the road, a small Carthaginian unit pretended to retreat. Right on cue, the Roman commander, Flaminius, saw the fleeing enemy and sneered. "Cowards! After them!" His legion surged forward, drums pounding, shields clattering. The fog swallowed them whole. Suddenly, from the hills, came a roar like a thunderclap. Thousands of Carthaginian soldiers burst from hiding, their war cries tearing through the mist. Spears rained down. Cavalry thundered in from the flanks. The Romans, trapped between lake and hillside, realized too late they had marched into a graveyard. Panic spread as the fog thickened, turning friend and foe into shadows. Horses screamed. Men stumbled into the lake, their armor dragging them under. Flaminius fought bravely, slashing left and right, but a spear found his chest. He fell without a sound, another nameless corpse swallowed by the fog. From a nearby ridge, Hannibal watched the massacre unfold. The screams below mingled with the hiss of arrows. "Rome will choke on this defeat," he murmured, though his expression remained hard. War was no place for gloating. It was a storm, and storms were fickle. The news of Trasimene hit Rome like a thunderbolt. In the Senate, voices cracked with rage and fear. "This man is a demon," one senator cried. Another whispered, "Has Jupiter himself abandoned us?" The people wailed in the streets, mothers clutching their children as if Hannibal's elephants might burst through the city gates at any moment. Rome's response was to appoint a dictator, Quintus Fabius Maximus. But Fabius was not like the others. Where his peers demanded glorious battle, Fabius proposed something shocking: delay. "We will not fight him head-on," Fabius said calmly. "We will starve him, bleed him, make Italy a wasteland until he withers." Many called him a coward. "Hannibal walks our lands unchallenged," they spat. But Fabius ignored them. He knew rushing in meant disaster. Hannibal, however, saw Fabius's game. One hot summer evening, he led his army to a rich valley and deliberately burned the countryside, except for one estate. When Roman scouts reported back, Fabius's allies whispered angrily, "Hannibal spares his land. Fabius is in league with him." The Senate began to doubt their own leader. Mago chuckled beside the fire. "You plant seeds of distrust even as you burn their crops." Hannibal allowed himself a small smile. War isn't only fought with swords. Sometimes, suspicion kills faster than steel. But Rome was not as fragile as he hoped. Young, reckless commanders soon replaced Fabius, eager to restore Roman honor. They swore to bring Hannibal down in a single, decisive clash. Hannibal welcomed the challenge. He knew their pride would lead them exactly where he wanted, into the jaws of destruction. The stage was set for something far greater than Trebia or Trasimene. Hannibal's spies whispered of two massive Roman armies gathering near Cannae. 80,000 men, the largest force Rome had ever assembled, were marching to crush him once and for all. From a windswept hill, Hannibal surveyed the plains of Apulia, where golden wheat swayed in the summer wind. He narrowed his eyes, imagining the coming storm. "Let them come," he said quietly, almost to himself. "Let them bring all of Rome's might. We will break them where they feel strongest." The sun dipped low, painting the fields blood-red. Carthaginian campfires flickered like a constellation across the plain. Among the soldiers, excitement and dread mingled in equal measure. They whispered of the Romans' numbers, of their own weary limbs. But Hannibal moved through the camp with steady steps, offering a word here, a nod there. To them, he was not just a general, he was proof that impossible things could be done. Still, even Hannibal felt the weight of what lay ahead. In the quiet of his tent, he unfolded his father's old map of Italy and traced the road to Rome with a calloused finger. So close yet so far. He closed his eyes, hearing his father's voice. Never be a friend of Rome. The oath was now a destiny, and tomorrow at Cannae, destiny would be tested like never before. The morning of Cannae dawned hot and breathless, the air already shimmering over the wheat fields of Apulia. Dust hung low, stirred by the movements of nearly 80,000 Roman soldiers assembling in tight ranks. Their shields gleamed under the rising sun, a wall of bronze and iron that stretched as far as the eye could see. Drums thundered, standards snapped in the breeze. This was Rome at its proudest, its largest army ever gathered in one place. Across the plain, Hannibal's much smaller force, barely half the Roman numbers, stood quietly. Carthaginian infantry tightened the leather straps on their armor. Numidian horsemen adjusted their saddles, their sleek horses stamping impatiently. At the center of it all, Hannibal Barca surveyed the field with calm intensity. His cloak fluttered in the hot wind, and a faint smile played at the corner of his mouth. Mago approached, his face etched with worry. Brother, they outnumber us 2-1. Even your brilliance cannot change that. Hannibal didn't take his eyes off the Roman formation. Numbers are not strength, he said quietly. Pride blinds them. They will press forward like a hammer, and a hammer can be broken if it strikes the wrong way. He gestured toward his troops. Today we give Rome a wound it will never forget. The Roman consuls, Varro and Paulus, argued even as their legions formed up. Varro, hot-headed and arrogant, spat on the ground. We crush him today, or we are not Romans. Paulus, older and more cautious, hesitated. The gods do not favor reckless pride. But Varro refused to wait. The signal was given. Horns blared. Rome advanced. The ground trembled as thousands of sandals struck the earth in unison. A sea of scarlet cloaks and bronze helmets rolled forward, the sun flashing off their shields. Dust clouds rose like storm fronts. Hannibal's first line, a thin crescent of Iberian and Gallic infantry, moved back deliberately, giving ground inch by inch. To the Romans it looked like panic. Cheers erupted in their ranks. "They're breaking!" the soldiers shouted. They surged harder, compressing themselves into a tighter column to smash the Carthaginian center. But Hannibal's withdrawal was no rout. It was bait. His crescent line bent inward, curving like a bowstring. As the Romans poured in, they funneled deeper into a trap. On the flanks, Hannibal's African infantry, veterans clad in captured Roman armor, waited silently. Mago glanced at Hannibal. "Now?" "Not yet," Hannibal murmured. He watched the Romans press deeper, their formation swelling and disorganized. Then, with a sudden, fierce gesture, he shouted, "Now!" From both flanks, Carthaginian infantry slammed inward, their shields clanging as they closed around the Roman mass. At the same moment, Numidian cavalry, light, fast, deadly, circled behind and cut off the Roman rear. Dust exploded into the sky. Trumpets screamed. The Roman legions found themselves surrounded, completely enveloped in what would become known as the double envelopment, a maneuver studied by generals for centuries to come. Inside the Roman column, panic turned to horror. The press of bodies was so tight men could barely lift their swords. Spears jabbed from all sides. Horses trampled the fallen. Blood pooled in the wheat fields, soaking the dry earth. Soldiers screamed for the gods, for their mothers, for Rome itself. From a rise overlooking the chaos, Hannibal sat astride his horse, his face grim but unflinching. Victory was his, but victory always had a price. He watched the slaughter without exultation, only a hard understanding. This was what it took to bring an empire to its knees. The battle raged for hours under the merciless sun. By the end of the day, 50,000 Romans lay dead or dying, an entire generation of soldiers wiped from the Republic's rolls. Among the survivors, despair ran deeper than wounds. Rome, the eternal, the invincible, had been humiliated in a single day. That night, the Carthaginian camp was eerily quiet. There was no drunken revelry, no gloating. The men were too exhausted, too aware of the magnitude of what they had done. Hannibal walked alone among the fires, listening to the distant cries of wounded Romans on the battlefield. He should have marched on Rome immediately, but his supplies were low, his men battered, and the city's walls formidable. Even Hannibal, bold as he was, knew that a direct assault on the capital might destroy everything he had gained. Still, whispers spread. Rome is broken. One more strike and the Republic falls. In Rome, chaos reigned. Mothers tore their hair in grief. Senators whispered of abandoning the city. But in the midst of despair, one voice rose. The steady, unshaken voice of Quintus Fabius Maximus. Rome still stands, he told the Senate, and Rome will fight again. We will outlast him. His words planted a stubborn seed of hope. As Hannibal's army moved through southern Italy, city after city wavered. Some defected to him, opening their gates. Others doubled their loyalty to Rome, terrified of what Carthaginian victory might mean. Hannibal's gamble had shaken Italy to its core, but it had not toppled the Republic. Standing on a hill one evening, Hannibal looked north toward Rome. The setting sun bathed the distant horizon in gold. For a heartbeat, he imagined marching under those walls, hearing the panicked cries of senators and patricians. But the moment passed. War was not a single blow, it was a long, grinding game. The fields of southern Italy baked under a relentless summer sun as Hannibal's army moved like a shadow across the land. Smoke curled from farmhouses, some burned by Carthaginian raiders, others torched by Romans themselves to deny Hannibal supplies. Years had passed since Cannae, and still Rome would not fall. For every city Hannibal wooed, Rome tightened its grip on another. For every victory, the Republic absorbed the blow and grew harder, like iron tempered in fire. In Capua, a wealthy Italian city that had joined Hannibal after Cannae, Hannibal stood on a marble balcony overlooking a bustling square. His officers enjoyed the comforts of their alliance: fine wine, soft beds, warm meals. But Hannibal's gaze was distant. The city was rich, yet its loyalty felt shallow. He knew Rome's reach was long. Mago approached quietly. "We should march on Rome now," he said. "Every day we wait, their resolve grows." Hannibal shook his head. "The walls of Rome are strong, and our siege weapons are few. A failed assault would destroy us." His voice was calm, but a flicker of frustration crossed his face. Victory at Cannae had been the thunderbolt. Yet thunderbolts alone do not fell mountains. In Rome, Fabius Maximus urged patience. "Hannibal is a flame," he told the Senate. "If we smother him with our shields, he will burn us. But if we starve him of fuel, he will die." Rome began a brutal war of attrition, harassing Hannibal's foragers, avoiding pitched battles, and reclaiming defected cities one by one. The people hated this strategy. They wanted revenge, not patience. But in the countryside, Roman resilience showed its teeth. Villages Hannibal expected to welcome him slammed their gates shut. Local militias struck his supply lines under cover of darkness. Each small setback was like a thorn under the skin, small but constant and maddening. Still, Hannibal's genius kept him alive. In one daring raid, he outmaneuvered an entire Roman force by driving cattle with flaming torches tied to their horns through a mountain pass, tricking the Romans into believing his army was retreating by torchlight. As the Romans scrambled to follow, Hannibal's real force slipped through another path, vanishing like smoke. Soldiers laughed at their commander's cleverness that night, but Hannibal remained pensive. Winter came and went. Years turned. Hannibal roamed Italy like a phantom, undefeated in open battle, yet unable to land a killing blow. His men grew older, their ranks thinner. Reinforcements from Carthage were promised but rarely arrived. The Senate in Carthage squabbled, sending only token support. One chilly dawn, Hannibal stood by a riverbank, watching his reflection ripple in the water. His once black hair now streaked with gray, his armor dulled by years of dust and rain. He thought of his father, of the oath sworn so long ago. He had done the impossible, humiliated Rome again and again. And yet, Rome still breathed. Mago joined him, silent for a while. Finally, he said, "Brother, sometimes I think the gods favor them." Hannibal's jaw tightened. The gods favor no one. They favor those who endure. And Rome endures. Meanwhile, far to the north, a new Roman general was rising, Publius Cornelius Scipio, later called Scipio Africanus. Young, ambitious, and brilliant, Scipio watched Hannibal's campaigns and learned. "We cannot defeat him here," Scipio told his peers. "We must strike at Carthage itself." The plan was bold. Invade North Africa, force Carthage to recall Hannibal to defend his homeland. At first, the Senate balked. Sending an army across the sea while Hannibal still roamed Italy seemed madness. But desperation can breed daring. They agreed. As Scipio prepared his fleet, Hannibal received word. Carthage was threatened. The Senate begged him to return. He lingered for a moment on Italian soil, perhaps sensing that leaving meant abandoning his dream. He had marched elephants over the Alps, shattered Roman armies, and stalked Italy for more than a decade. Yet Rome had outlasted him. He gathered his men. "We sail for home," he said simply. There was no speech, no fanfare. Just the quiet understanding that their long, impossible campaign was over. The voyage south was rough, the sea churning as if the gods themselves protested. In Carthage, citizens lined the streets to welcome their hero. Hannibal, though older and wearier, still carried himself like a lion. Children stared wide-eyed, hearing tales of the man who had terrified Rome. But Hannibal knew glory was fragile. Carthage's resources were drained, its people divided. He would have to face Scipio on African soil, far from the mountains and plains where his genius had shone brightest. Standing on a cliffside one evening, overlooking the African coast, Hannibal watched the sunset paint the waves gold and crimson. He closed his eyes and remembered the snowy peaks of the Alps, the roar of elephants, the cries of dying legions. He had walked at the edge of legend. The wind cut across the battlefield like a cold blade. Smoke curled from shattered Roman standards, and the cries of the wounded echoed under a darkening sky. Hannibal stood atop a small rise, his armor streaked with blood and dust, his breath slow but steady. He had done the impossible. He had humiliated Rome on its own soil again and again. But deep inside, a quiet unease gnawed at him. He looked toward the horizon where the sun was sinking. The men around him, Gauls, Numidians, Iberians, were jubilant, shouting victory songs. Yet Hannibal's gaze was far away, toward a city he had not taken. Rome still stood. Its people were shaken but not broken. The turning tide. Back in Rome, the Senate halls trembled. Not with despair, but with resolve. Old men who had nearly abandoned hope now clenched their fists. Among them, a name began to rise. Publius Cornelius Scipio, a young commander who had watched Hannibal's tactics and learned from them. Scipio whispered to his closest advisors, "We will not wait for him to strike again. We will bring the war to his homeland." When word of Rome's plan reached Hannibal, he paused. For years, he had danced on Roman soil, but Carthage had left him with little support. Reinforcements had been promised, but they were always delayed or too few. Now, as Scipio sailed for North Africa, Hannibal was forced to abandon the land where he had nearly broken an empire. Zama, the final gamble. The plains of Zama baked under the African sun. Hannibal's elephants stood restless, their trunks swaying. Across the field, Scipio's legions gleamed like a wall of iron. Hannibal's heart was heavy. His men were fewer, his cavalry weakened. But pride, and perhaps destiny, demanded he face Rome one last time. As the horns sounded, the battle erupted. The elephants charged, but Scipio's men opened their ranks, letting the beasts thunder harmlessly through. Numidian cavalry, once Hannibal's ally, now fought for Rome. Betrayal cut deeper than any sword. Hannibal fought fiercely, cutting through Roman lines like a phantom. But slowly, inevitably, the tide turned. His troops crumbled. The dust of Zama swallowed his dream. When the final horn blew, Hannibal stood among the dead, silent. He had brought Rome to its knees, but he could not finish the job. The echo of legends. Years later, as an exile, Hannibal watched the sun set over foreign hills. He had been hunted across kingdoms. His name whispered in fear even by those who had never seen him. But he knew the truth. Rome had adapted. They had learned from his genius and used it against him. Perhaps, he murmured to an old companion, I showed them too much. Meanwhile, in Rome, Scipio was celebrated as Africanus, the man who saved the Republic. Yet even he admitted privately, against Hannibal, I faced the greatest captain of any age. Why it mattered. Hannibal's invasion was more than a string of battles. It was a test of will, one that forged Rome into something harder and sharper. The Republic became an empire because a Carthaginian general forced it to evolve. Even today, over 2,000 years later, the world remembers the man who crossed the Alps with elephants, who shattered armies many times his size, and who, though defeated, remained unconquered in legend. The camera would fade on a lone elephant skull, half buried in snow high in the Alps, a haunting reminder of the march that terrified Rome. And then the narrator's voice would close,